every time I mention sex in a group of 50 people, half of them are men, straight away there are some jokes around it. It's not something that leaves us untouched. We all have a reaction to that. But the thing is, not everybody can deal with that attention and that reaction.
Welcome to Real Relationships, a real and honest podcast about the inside world of working with close relationships. I'm Alona Serpentine, a couples therapist, a sex therapist, and a relationship educator. Here, I draw the curtain on how close relationships work, interview other relationship professionals, share behind-the-scenes stories from my own practice, and also invite couples, families, and individuals of all kinds to speak about their journey and their real relationships. We as humans cannot live without others. This is why I hope that by sharing the stories and reality-tested information from real professionals and real clients, more people will enjoy fulfilling, supporting, and successful relationships. If you want to have one of those, or make your existing ones even better, and I can't imagine you are not, tune into our episodes released twice a month on Thursdays. And to stay up to date with what we have to share, subscribe to our show on your favorite podcast platform or join our Facebook group, Real Relationships. Stay tuned and stay real.
Alona, good morning.
Morning, Nadia.
Sorry for the big pause. It's been a while since I interviewed somebody.
But you used to be a journalist, right?
Used to be the keyword. Now I'm an accountant, and it's quite an interesting podcast. An accountant interviewing. Can you present yourself? How do you call yourself now?
I call myself a relationship specialist. I guess that's an overarching term that describes me. But specifically, I work as a couples therapist and sex therapist.
Okay, that sounds a little bit boring. And if I were to ask you, in a very trivial terms, how would you describe yourself? If you were to explain it to a very simple person like myself.
Well, basically, I'm a person who knows a fair bit about relationships, and not just relationships that we are comfortable talking about, but also what's happening behind the closed doors. So I know what people do in their most intimate spaces, including their families, their living rooms, their bedrooms, and I help them to enjoy those places a bit more.
Okay, you sound like a peeping Tom, just with a big degree. Is it right?
Well, quite a few big degrees, actually. But
kill us with all your degrees and we will get it out of the way.
I think it could be a little bit boring to list all of them. But I guess in a nutshell, recently I took a moment to count how many years I spent at universities. And it's 15 and a half years of full-time education.
You were institutionalized. Can't pronounce this word.
I think so. I think it's a little bit of an obsession and an addiction. But yes, basically 15 and a half years of tertiary education across 3 different countries, all up. But I guess the most interesting ones, I have a counseling degree. I have a master's of counseling degree, which I took to get into the therapeutic profession. And I also have a degree from Sydney University, specifically in psychosexual therapy.
Psychosexual therapy. So it has word psycho in it. It has sexual. Can you just break it up before I go down this path?
So I guess when we talk about sex, many people assume that it's a highly bodily experience.
Yes, of course. Straight away, everybody naked.
Well, exactly. So when we think about sex, we think about naked bodies and think what we do with those bodies. But of course, many people understand that. But the big part of sex and whatever we call sex, that's a different topic. But the big part of our sexuality, if not the biggest part of our sexuality, is our mind. It's our psychology. That's where that psychosexual bit comes in. Because our bodies, yes, they do have physiological urges. Yes, they do have instincts, but they are driven and kind of framed by the way we think about sex.
Urge to merge comes from upstairs.
100%.
Oh,
100%.
So what made you choose this path?
Well, it's an interesting question, but
Yeah, I only ask interesting ones.
I must say, and this may come as a surprise to many of my listeners, but I was quite a conservative person when it comes to sexuality.
Girls from Catholic schools are the best, they say.
Well, I never went to a Catholic school, but I did have some, I don't know, stereotypes or some shame even around sex for quite a while, or I didn't think it was comfortable talking about it. But when I started working as a couples therapist, very quickly I realized that I can't really help my couples if I don't talk about what's happening in the bedroom. And I decided to, what I always do, get another degree, go to another university and study the heck out of it so that I, first of all, know how to talk about it and what it's all about, and then give this knowledge to my couples. So initially it was more of a supplementary thing to assist the couples therapy. And now I've realized that it's not supplementary. They are completely one, if not even dominating the couples therapy. Because as soon as we start talking about sex, all masks are off.
Wow.
Very quickly.
Give me an example of a couple coming and what's normally happening. How the masks are off, what leads to it, because what I can see is two people just sitting looking at each other awkwardly, and it just the word sex flies, and it just like, ooh.
Well, it's interesting because when I used to be just a couples therapist, it would be all very prim and proper. We would come in, we would talk about communication, we would talk about some personal baggage that the couple may have, but the conversation would be always above the belt line, so to say. We would just be talking about things, about communication and so on.
With a proper cup of tea.
Yes, I would say so. It was all in that very civilized kind of, how to say, what we consider to be societally acceptable space here in Australia. Very rarely, only potentially with affair couples, that line, the belt line, would be crossed and it would go a little bit lower. But generally the conversation would still be very, very civilized, so to say. And then after the degree, when I started mentioning to people, even just absolutely kind of matter of fact, I'm also a sex therapist, boom, that mask or whatever that cover up was pulled away quicker than a bed sheet, if you want to say. It was
so Friday.
Very quickly. And that was amazing. It's like even now talking about it, I have a bit of a smile because the only thing that I had to do, I had to say, guys, welcome, nice to meet you. I'm a couples therapist and a sex therapist. What brings you here today? And very, very quickly, the couple staff and sex staff, they would be right there in front of me within the first 30 minutes. And what I did, I only introduced the word sex into the conversation.
So can you tell me what's so special about this word? It's obviously not the word itself, but this sound, what it evokes in human minds and human behavior, mostly behavior. It's quite provocative here. Why? I think it's a little bit of me here, so just debug me anytime. It stems from the fact that there is a taboo. It's very stereotypical that there should be some kind of shame and privacy attached to it, and it's not normal and proper to talk about it. So how do you overcome this barrier?
Well, first of all, I must agree that to a large extent, I must say, by far not everyone, and that's changing. Most people do feel some sort of shame when they talk about their sexuality. And sexuality is much broader than just what we do in the bedroom, right? It's also what we think about sexuality and sex. It's how we identify. So all those things are generally quite personal. And we often are still confused ourselves about it. It's probably something that we continue to explore throughout our life. And that's why many people either feel they don't really know themselves that well to talk about it openly. Those who are not really ashamed, they just still not really sure what to say about it. That's one category. But the other category are people who were led to believe, normally through their families, maybe also if they follow a religion, through their faith, or maybe just the way how people react to the word sex in this society, that's not something that people easily talk about. It always causes a reaction. And Nadia, as you know, every time I mention sex in a group of 50 people, half of them are men, straight away there are some jokes around it. It's not something that leaves us untouched. We all have a reaction to that. But the thing is, not everybody can deal with that attention and that reaction. And people naturally adjust. I was like, ooh, I'm a center of attention. I said something and everybody laughed, or everybody points a finger at me. That's why people either hide, or if they're confident and comfortable enough, they continue the conversation. And I think if we want to change that, if we want to have healthier sexual lives, we need to be more comfortable talking about it, sharing it, but also dealing with those comments and reactions that we get.
I think there is a little bit of naughty component there. Yeah, I'm so naughty. It's just a little bit of immaturity also comes up quite often. If it's in a group setup, that's what I see from people's reaction. That's how I interpret it. You can, again, object if it's not the way you see it. What I also see when you start talking, it takes a while for personal energy to settle. They're just really distracted by it completely. So
that shows the power. That shows the power that sexuality holds over us. I think I mentioned before to you when we talked in our private conversations that I have a very strong belief that sexuality is a core of everything that we do. It's just that our definition of sexuality is often quite narrow. We only think about it as a physiological contact with other people or with ourselves. But I believe that all our energy is expression of our sexuality. It's what gives us the drive, that natural drive. The libido sometimes is considered to be the vitality of a person rather than necessarily just the sex drive. And it's absolutely understandable that as soon as you touch on something so potent and so powerful and so central to everyone, especially to a group that is male dominated, it just sends that ripple effect throughout them because we're touching on something so
I also think there is a strong chemical reaction in brain with this keyword.
100%.
And there is a chain reaction of also, so because there is a sparkle in the eye,
100%.
going on giggle and everything. So
can I just add a fun fact on that?
Yes.
So female sexuality is actually much more reactive than male sexuality.
Oh, okay.
Which not many people would think of, because typically we think men talking about sex more than females talking about sex. But females physiologically and biologically are much more reactive to any sexual stimuli.
Okay.
So as soon, there are studies even that show that even females just listening to, let's say, animals engaging in a sexual act arouses our physiological nervous system. So we get aroused by anything remotely sexual.
Okay.
It's not that means that we want to have sex, but we feel something is happening.
I will think about it next time I hear cats on the roof and possums breathing heavily at night. Interesting. Alena, you obviously lived in quite a few countries, not obvious for listeners, but obvious for me. First time I met you, you told me you're fluent in German and you are fluent in Italian and you're fluent in Russian and you're fluent in
No
English.
Italian.
No, not yet. Okay. So all this fluent means you have spent significant amount of time in different cultures. Can we it's purely your observation. And of course, it will be element of generalization. I'm just trying to prevent attacks by people. Not everybody is the same. Yes, of course not. But there are pockets of population which represent medium behavior. If I were to talk about these particular significant pockets of population, and their characteristics across cultures. Let's start with your mother country and move as you progressed in your life. How is the sexuality perceived there, then, and now? and the same for the other countries. And does culture have impact on sexuality?
100%. And I think that's it's a big part of this whole psycho part of a psychosexual perspective on sex. Like any personality is influenced by the context that we live in. So cultural norms, they permeate the way how we think about sex. For example, typically, it's funny, there are studies that were conducted across, let's say, a French population, the American population, the USA, and then, let's say, the Latin American populations. And very basic kind of indicator of how connected physically people are is the amount of touch that people do when, for example, they are out for dinner. So what they did, they observed different couples across those three settings, and then they simply counted how much touch is happening. So I can't really remember now the exact numbers, but there was something along the lines that in France, it was around 30 times an hour. In Mexico, it was, let's say, 35 times an hour. And then a big bombshell in the USA, 0.
Wow. Okay.
Or maybe something very small like 1. But that's kind of an indicator how different cultures are with human contact in general. And I mean, living here in Australia, we have such a multitude of different cultures, but I'm sure people can already think that, for example, the Hindu culture would be very different in their sexuality. The Chinese culture, typically the Asian cultures are quite conservative about sex. It's not something that is much talked about. And then we also have the Anglo-Saxon community that is, I would say, also a little bit more on the conservative spectrum, even though we have sex pretty much everywhere in advertised and soap operas, all those reality shows. All of this has some sexual undertone, but generally still quite conservative. But then we may have cultures, let's say, more from the Hispanic world, also a bit more of the Eastern European world, where I feel they have a slightly more open look at sexuality. And that kind of leads me to my personal experience. I lived for an extended period of time in Russia, where I grew up. And then in Germany, I spent there 5 years. And then I moved to Australia, and it had been now, I think, close to 12 years overall. And I would say probably from all of those three cultures, funnily enough, Australia is the most conservative when it comes to sex.
I totally agree with you. What struck me the most when I came to Australia, it's the way the parties, the social gathering was conducted. We were invited to one of the nicest families here, local in Mornington Peninsula. There was a nice party. I came dressed a little bit open because I thought it's an evening party. That's how you're supposed to dress yourself up for that. Women looked at me quite strangely. Don't know. I couldn't understand what's going on. And then the music started playing. And in Russian party, you would just dance with different person. Every time you would swap. And people were mixing in Russia. Where I came here, nobody was mixing. Men were on one side with the beer, women on the other side. And I was kind of caught myself in the middle. I was thinking, with probably a very strange expression on my face. I couldn't understand what's going on. Why such a big segregation within a party? What's the point being on a party? Mates could go to the bar and girls can have their night out. But when they're together, they still have this separation. And that's probably my first cultural shock was.
I have a very similar experience. And as both of us know, growing up in Russia, boys and girls, they're always together. We play same games on schoolyards. We don't really have a separate sex schools. It's all co-eds. So boys and girls, they're always together. And that was a very similar experience for me in Germany. Probably not to the same extent as in Russia, but still, boys and girls were generally quite mixed. And then when I arrived here in Australia, I also noticed how segregated, as you said, the groups were. And then when I learned about single-sex schools, I was really perplexed because I thought, how does that work that you teach a child or keep a child for nearly a decade in one sex school, and then you expect them to spend the rest of their lives in mixed gender communities. How do you prepare them for that relationship? And of course, there are co-ed schools now where that's all mixed together, but I still think societally there is a big separation between boys and girls, which in my experience as a couple therapist is one of the biggest problems when I see my couples, because they don't really know how to interact with each other.
So it's from very early age, they learn to separate, and they carry it through the life. And when they come together, what's the main issue is communication.
Pretty much. It's
perception of another gender is something alien.
It's exactly, you just nailed it on its head. These are the exact two problems that all couples, regardless whether we talk about money or we talk about sex, where the problems are. It's the problem of perception, is seeing the opposite sex as different to you, which is, of course, we all have biological differences, but I would say they are less than what we tend to think about them. And then it's about communication. Men and women very often just don't know how to communicate with each other. Mm-hmm. And the issue is when I have these two together, and when they kind of stop listening simply because they say, oh, she's a woman or he's a man. And that has been instilled there, I don't know, since very little. You can imagine that this is a massive wall that I need to break down.
Speaking of breaking the walls, there is another, it's 180-degree opposite phenomena happens here. That's what I found. It's two things. One night stand, and very common. And another one is phenomena which I also had to culturally unpack for myself. It's likability of swingers, all those clubs and everything, where it's polar opposite. On one side, we have a very conservative representative, this, as I said, pockets. And then we have pocket of this very rowdy crowd. And especially, I couldn't fathom the one night stand concept, because to me, it's contraceptive. You don't know person. Maybe someone get off with being with a stranger, but to me, it's just sexuality is about communication. It's not exchange of body fluids straight away. It's all about exchanging some more valuable content first up front, and only then it's just a closure. For some, it's opening.
Well, we connect in very different ways, and what makes us feel alive is also quite different. So yes, I would say it is a healthy approach to build a relationship, a little bit of a safety around the person first before you go all the way and share your body fluids with them. Yes, it could be more of a safe kind of way to approach things. And I would say in a committed relationship, that's exactly what we want to facilitate, that a person feels emotionally safe. They know the person who they're sleeping with. And then they exchange body fluids, especially because especially if it's opposite sex relationships, there is always a potential of, let's say, falling pregnant as a result. And then you're basically connected for life. But for some people, those one night stands, that's an opportunity to explore, first of all, different things. It's also an opportunity to get rid of that safety and experience a little bit of a thrill and excitement. And when I'm thinking about it, especially because we both Russians are thinking about it probably slightly from a why question perspective. Why do that? Well, think about it. When we think about the safety levels in Russia and the safety levels in Australia, or even, for example, in Germany, I think we know that Australia and Germany are much safer than Russia, where things just happen on every corner. And that thrill is just a natural component of life. That's why we don't need any extra thrills and any extra adrenaline rush. But in safer countries where we are a little bit coddled, so to say, in safety everywhere, we miss that excitement. And one night stand can give it to you.
You just touched exactly. Thank you for answering this question, because it was bothering me. This obsession of Australians with reading about war, watching war movies and everything.
They miss the pain.
they miss the pain. And when we come from the way we constantly in horrible wars where we lose our boys and we cause pain to other nations, it's just terrible guilt and everything apart from
There
this.
is a very strong connection between pain and pleasure. A very strong connection between pain and pleasure. And I don't even need to go into the sexual domain to give examples from that. Lots of people like spicy food. Or like spicy food. Why? Spice is burning their mouths, but if it's connected with a little bit of flavor, it amplifies all the sensations. And we always need a bit of a balance of a bit of pain and in order to experience more pleasure. So if we don't have a little bit of pain, then our pleasure is a little bit lame.
Should I introduce a VIP to my consulting sessions so clients a little bit more awake?
Well, you introduce a VIP by charging them a bit. That's their painful experience. They appreciate you more. That's the same law in marketing. So if you want a Louis Vuitton bag, as my husband says, probably costs only a couple of dollars to make. But if you put a painful price tag to it, suddenly that Louis Vuitton bag for you is an obsessive object that you want to have.
Wow. Also in our private conversations, we had a few with you, and I really appreciate you as my friend, as well as my
Sexuality consultant.
Well, I don't think I was getting into my sexuality consultant because I'm just consider myself a curious meerkat who just stands up on her hind paws and watches around what's going on. That's why hence this podcast with expert, and I just like get to know different things.
And that's a wrap. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Real Relationships podcast. For more reality-tested relationship information, visit our Facebook group, Real Relationships. Or if you have a question or a guest suggestion for me to interview next, email me at podcast@alionaserpentine.com.au. Stay tuned and stay real.